Okay, so today's talk will be on what I've been doing for my PhD for the past 4 years, and that's phonological acquisition in multi-accent Singapore, and in fact other multi-accent contexts. I'd like to start with oops. Yeah, okay. I'd like to start with input variability in general. So we know that children acquire language from the input they receive from people, from the caregivers, from their peers. But it's not always the case that the input that they receive is homogeneous. So a lot of children acquire the sound system in context that is multi-accent, that has a lot of accents, variability, and we'll look at some examples later. Despite that variability, that's a lot of uncertainty about what effects there would be on development and also on the outcomes of the children. So a lot of work, there's actually quite a bit of work on multi-dialectal children that has focused very much on word recognition and representation, so a lot of psycholinguistic questions. And those production studies that looked at variation has looked at acquisition of variation rather than how variation influences or impacts acquisition. It's not working again. And I'd like to talk a little bit of what I mean by multi-accent Singapore. So we know that there is a lot of language content in Singapore, and language content occurs all the way back from the 1800s when English was introduced to a land and it contacted with indigenous languages. So despite the fact that English was already spoken in the past, most of the Singaporeans only began to speak English in the 1960s when we introduced the bilingual policy. So a lot of the speakers, like my parents, are L2 speakers of English. Right, so there's a lot of bilingualism effect on their pronunciation, their accents. And because of the language contact, the prolonged language contact, there are pan-Singaporean features that emerge from that, but also they sound ethnically distinct because of their second language that they spoke. And the same thing today, a lot of us today are L1 speakers or native speakers of this contact variety of English that is quite stabilized, and so are the caregivers of children in my corpus. And because of that prolonged language contact, there's a lot of variation that come from intergenerational transmission from their parents, right? So speaking differently because of the parents, from individual bilingualism, because we still speak our other language today, although to different extents, and influence from peers. Exonormative norms from the Western standards that we are taught in schools. And also because of that repertoire, we also change the way we talk based on different contexts. Right, so there's a lot of variation within an individual and between individuals. And this is just an example of how varied that can be. There is inter-ethnic variation, there's intra-ethnic variation within ethnic group, and within individuals, there's a lot of variation, depending on how you want to view the variation. It could be because of the different socio-indexical meanings of the variants. It could be because of formality, cultural orientation, and so on. So then my main question is what happens then when children are exposed to such multi-accent input? And I'd like to look at this question by examining the acquisition of laterals, the L sound, by English Malay bilingual preschoolers in Singapore. For those who don't know, we have to date studied 3 different variants of coda L, that's L happening at end of syllables. So we have this one that's most popular, the dark L. This is the L associated with the Western varieties of English, such as Southern British English and American English. So for a word like ball, in addition to the contact of the tongue tip to our velar ridge, there's also a velarization. So it's ball, if you can hear the exaggerated O sound. So that's dark L. The darkness comes from velarization. And then we have 2 variants of L in Singapore. One of it is clear L. And what we understand so far about clear L is that this is Malay derived, a phonetic trait from Malay. And that's because L in Malay is all clear, right? So they will say, for example, bantal, right? Bantal, kecil, gatal. Can you hear the L is different from L, right? So that's clear L. And because of that, we find that in Malays in Singapore. And let's hear some examples of this.
So I saw him fall.
Say again.
So I saw him fall.
It's freezing cold. It's freezing cold.
Can you hear the L? Yeah, okay. And finally, for a lot of Chinese Singaporeans, we have a variant called L-lessness, and that is the contact with the rich is lost. So for words like mile, we will say mao, right? We change it into like a vowel-like sound, so L vocalization. For heel, we will say heel. For ball, it can be deleted, so it sounds like ball or bowl. And children, it becomes like children, right? So there are three different variants here. And to the children in Singapore, the English Malay bilinguals especially, they are exposed to all the different variants, right, in different quantities and extents. So I found that in the caregiver input, in informal child-directed speech, Malay caregivers use the Malay-derived clear L more frequently than L-lessness. So this is an example.
What are you trying to make?
I'm trying to make super triangle.
Super triangle.
So that's clear L. But I also found that in formal literary context, when mothers are teaching words or reading a book, mothers only would switch to a dark variety, the dark L, or they would vocalize more, like the mainstream variants.
Nail.
Again?
Nail.
Snail.
Nail.
Snail.
Nail.
Right, so you can see that the mother is trying to tell them that this is how you should pronounce it if you want to pronounce the word correctly, right? And I also found that not just being exposed to the caregiver input, but also they are exposed to people, significant others in the wider English-Malay bilingual community. So I found that the Malay-dominant Malays tend to use more of the Malay-derived trait, more clear L. So they'll say school, snail, more often than the English-dominant Malays, who would say school or ball, right, with the velarized L. And they are equally educated and they also learn English at about the same time. So I think it's more about cultural orientation more than bilingualism. And finally, of course, we will interact in schools. In preschools, we will have children of other ethnicity. So clearly, they will be exposed to the eldest dominant variety of their Chinese peers, right? Who will say ball or children or school instead of school or school, right? So the Chinese would use more of the eldest form. If not, then they'll use dark L, but they will never say ball or school, typically, right? Chinese people wouldn't, not Chinese people, but ethnically Chinese Singaporeans wouldn't do that, typically. So then my question is, what happened to the lateral system then? What's happening to the L then, if there's so much variation in the Ls they receive? So I have two studies here. The first one, I looked at controlled stimuli. So I asked, the mothers asked the kid to name picture cards, right? So this would be snail, this would be ball. And also I also looked at the spontaneous mother-directed speech in casual conversation. So when you're playing games and puzzle, I recorded the Ls that they produce. So let's look at the first one first, the controlled stimuli. And for this study, I was interested in whether and how they establish distinct lateral systems, because for English, they have clear L, which is also the L that's used in Malay, right? So what happens to that, to their lateral system? So I have 14 English Malay bilingual preschoolers between 3 to 6 years old. And the amount of English used varied quite a little bit. So some of them were more English dominant than others. I was also interested to see whether the friends they interact with, because logically speaking, if you have interacted with more Chinese people or kids, then you may be exposed to more of the Chinese lateral model, right, than others who only have Malay friends, right? So 7 of them had Malay-only friends, whereas the other 7 had at least one Chinese peer, close friend. So I asked the mother to note down the significant people in the child's life, the significant friends in the child's life. And I'm also interested in the preschool type. So 8 of them attended Malay dominant preschools, and the other 6 of them were in ethnically diverse preschools. So what I did was that I looked at the Ls in from picture naming, I then analyze to see whether they were L-less. That's a missing IPA symbol there. They were L-less or not L-less. And for those that not L-less, that means that the L is there. I also analyze to see whether it's darker like L, or did they produce something that's clearer like L, right? And we have to note that dark and clear L, it's a gradient, it's a spectrum rather than L or L, right? It can be in between. And I was also interested to see whether there are any social predictors I looked at that could predict whether they were producing more L-less or whether they were very, very clear, for example. So I was interested in the predictors. So this is what I found for controlled stimuli. On the left, you have the realizations of coda L. So the blue would be L-less, like the ball, school, and then the yellow would be either clear, like school, or dark, like school, right? But at this stage, I didn't measure the darkness. So you can see that compared to Malay, the kids tend to, overall, be more likely to be L-less in their laterals, right? So they are more likely to say school or children than bantau or gatau, right? For Malay, you can see that they have produced the Malay laterals correctly most of the time. So across children, they tend to be more L-less in English than in Malay. Just like their caregivers, actually. You see that for Malay caregivers, they will preserve the clear L in Malay, but in English, they tend to be variably L-less sometimes, the blue. And this is for the Chinese children. I didn't have time to change the color still. So blue, orange, yellow. And you can see that for the Chinese children, they are categorically L-less, right? They will say ball and school all the time. And then I ran some regression analysis and found that even though children, across children, they were more likely to be L-less in English than in Malay, I found that those with Chinese peers were more likely to be L-less in English compared to those who only had Malay peers. In other words, there could be some peer effects because remember, the Chinese peers are always blue, right? And the children who had at least one Chinese peer tend to be more blue in Malay than, in English, than their friends who only had Malay friends. And language dominance didn't predict any difference. Right, and so we always think that, oh, because you spoke more Malay, therefore you sound more Malay. But this is not the case here. It's more about if you have Chinese friends, you tend to sound less Malay in this case. And I also looked at then the clearness and darkness of the retained laterals. So I found that across syllable position, so onset will be like the L in front of words like light versus the coda, which is the after syllable. You see that they're all similarly clear, right, and comparable to Malay. So for across Malay children, if they retain the L, it would be clear L. So if the child doesn't say school, the child would say school, typically, most of the time, even though we see some cases of biliarized L here. So this is a summary of part one. We saw that all children produce clear L, the L, right, like their caregivers, regardless of the amount of Malay that's used. So it could be the fact that it's not because of cross-linguistic influence, but rather acquired from their parents because the parents use it. And we also saw that children were more likely to be L-less in English, but those who had Chinese friends were more likely to be L-less, right? So perhaps we also see some clear effects, right, for controlled stimuli. Okay, let's move on to spontaneous speech. So we know that spontaneous speech is so difficult to analyze because there's so much variability. We can't account for lexical effects, right? So what I wanted to do is, so I had 5 more children in this sample, but 14 belong to also the previous study. So there's so much variation, and my goal for this study was to see whether we can find any patterns, right? Whether it's linguistic constraints or social constraints. So I ran a bit of clustering. I looked at individual lexical items, right? Individual words. And I also ran Bayesian regression just to see what could predict whether in this mass of things we could see any patterns. And yes, we can. Okay, no, before that. So here it tells you how variable the production is. You have on the left, children on the left, MI19, children who were categorically not clear. I see that now I've reversed the colors and it can be a bit confusing. So now if it's yellow, it's not clear. So these people were saying ball, school, children all the time, right? They don't say ball or school. Whereas children at the far right, you can see that no matter what the context is, they retain the L and they will say school, ball, child, will, and so on, all the time, right? So there is a great inter-child variation and also intra-child variation that could be predicted by phonetic context. So you can see that across all children, L that happens before a pause, if I say, I want a ball, that L is more likely to be retained and clear than it was pre-consonantal. So if I say, I want the ball now, it tends to be I want the ball now, right? Okay, because of the consonant of now. And I found actually within this variation actually patterns. So just a reminder, this is the caregiver norm. So they produce the Malay clear L in English, but they do so variably according to phonetic context. So pre-pausal, they were more likely to say ball, but pre-consonantal, they were less likely to retain the L. And we saw that there are some children who actually reflect this pattern, right? They were producing clear L and variably L-lessness, but it kind of followed the linguistic constraint showed by the mothers, right? So they reflect adult targets. And then we also see very young children who are just starting to produce L. And I found that these children only produce L in pre-pausal context. So it could be due to physiological challenges, difficulties, or it could be they're overcoming some kind of constraints if you're looking at a constraint-based kind of acquisition theory, right? The more interesting ones are the two other groups. So one of the group, which consider about 5-6 children, they were categorical producers of L. So regardless the context, even if it's before consonants, they would retain the L and they would do the clear L, like ball. I want the ball now, right? And this could be because they regularized the variable input. So we have studies that looked at statistical learning for children. What they did was they put them in a lab, not caged up, of course, but with the parents. And then they let the children hear a fake language that is variable. So they hear, for example, variant A, and then hear variant B. So they are not predicted statistically, they are random. And they found that children would actually pick the most frequent variant and then they would produce it for all the production, right? So it could be that these children being exposed to variability chose the most frequent, most salient variant and produce it for all the L's. And therefore they're categorical in the production. And finally, we have this group here that's very variable. So within their own production, you see a lot of variability. For the same word, for example, in the same context, they can say ball, they can say ball, they can say ball, for example. And interestingly, 5 of 6 in this group had at least one Chinese peer. So is this, again, the same kind of peer effects that we see? And then I was interested to see if these children, these 5, particularly 5 or 6 children, were to be more L-less, do they retain some of the L, and what words do they use, like ball and child, and what do they not? So I found that these words, ball, girl, small, circle, all, across the children, right, regardless of how much they are L-less, they tend to produce this with the clear L. So they will always say ball or girl, right? And then for these words though, they were more likely to be L-less. They were triangle, uncle, cereal, turtle, wheel, right? So maybe one way to explain this kind of lexical divergence is not a rule-based kind of theory, but maybe like an exemplar-based. So in this kind of account of learning, we learn words by being exposed to them. So every individual exposure would create kind of a representation. So I suppose like these words, they are used when they were younger and also more frequent, right? Because these are very simple words that they would be exposed to very, very regularly. So perhaps then their representations could be very robust because of the frequent exposure to these exemplars. Whereas for these words, because they could be more complex, newer, longer, and therefore the representations could be less stable and therefore more easily influenced by their Chinese peers, perhaps. So the conclusion is that we can see that such kind of variability is ubiquitous, it's everywhere, very, very common. And we should not just assume that because they're monolinguals or L1 speakers that they should speak the same, right? Even actually look at British English speakers, they are so varied in their pronunciation. And especially in such context, we need to accurately quantify what kind of individual variability there is, right? It's not enough to say that, these kids are producing L, but what kind of L are they producing and how are they producing it? And finally, exactly what I said, it's not enough to say that they are kind of like monolinguals in our context, right? They always say, oh, you have to speak like monolinguals or you have to speak like native speakers. I think we should move away from that to see how they actually negotiate that kind of variable input and what kind of variation is meaningful to them and therefore shape the way they speak. Yeah, and thank you very much.